Hi, Major Ben. Thank you so much for joining me on the Beyond Insurance podcast. How are you?
Good, good. And yourself?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for coming back. I know that we had a program a number of months ago, so I am very familiar with your background. But for those that may not know who Major Ben is, why don't you give some context on your background and history?
Well, I was one of the first African Americans to enlist in the Pennsylvania State Police back in 1961, and I rose to the rank of major. That's why they called me Major Ben. And in that capacity, I became one of the first African American captains. At the same time, I was promoted to a troop commander, which I was covering three counties: Lehigh, Northampton, and Bucks counties. And I did it from 1982 to 1987. And I went to transferred to Harrisburg in 1987 with under the Casey administrations to head up the affirmative action contract compliance function. In that capacity, I developed the sexual harassment policies and procedures, as well as the training programs. And at the same time, I was involved with an interagency task force dealing with diversity, inclusion, affirmative action, and its relation to hate crimes as we were teaching law enforcement and corrections folks throughout Pennsylvania. Then I retired in 1992, started my own business, Laser Bands Consulting, dealing with issues such as diversity and inclusion, and impact of bias, dealing with difficult people, policing your image and communication skills. In 2008 and 2010, all 600 judges of the minor judiciary of Pennsylvania had to go through my course on how to deal with difficult people as well as diversity. And this year, we're starting around with them is dealing with unconscious bias as it deals with them in the criminal justice system in the courts. So that's basically where we are right now.
Mhm. And you have such a long track record of helping and giving back to the community as a true servant leader that you are. But how did it feel being the only person of color in a very white dominated space when you began your career?
It was quite interesting because as a child growing up, I grew up in North Carolina and I worked on various farms. And I remember one day, one lady in the community used to get workers to go for various farms. And this particular day, I was the only one from my community who went out. And I was, for the first time in my life, and by the way, I grew up in a segregated society in North Carolina. But this particular day, I was the only person of color in that whole group, and it was so unnerving, was unbelievable. I couldn't eat. I was just a nervous wreck the whole day. Now, what is interesting, no one said anything or did anything out of the ordinary, but they were good people. But it was just part of my cultural programming because in our area there was a large proliferation of the Ku Klux Klan, and I used to hear some weird stories about them. And at that time, I walked away that day and I said, I hope I will never, ever put myself in a position like that ever again, only to recognize that was a precursor for what my life would be like, for the rest of my life. It's so that when I got into law enforcement, and being one of the two African Americans with at the State Police Academy, it really was that bad. We didn't experience any overt incidents while we were in the academy, so I was kind of conditioned to that by that time, particularly after having been in the army.
Mhm. And when we think about, and the reason why we brought you onto this podcast and why we thought would be a perfect fit is we know that the insurance industry is going through this transformation of being more inclusive and diverse within agencies, carriers, and all the different segments that are in this wonderful industry. So when you brought your level of diversity into the force, in what ways did that impact the perception of the Pennsylvania State Troopers?
Well, it gave them an opportunity to look at the world different than what they had experienced before. When you're in a monocultural situation, you think monoculturally, and nothing exists beyond your boundaries. And what it means, then you miss the rest of what the world is really all about. By coming in, bringing in a difference, they have a chance to see a different side of life, particularly when you recognize who your customer base really is. If you say, well, I am here to protect and serve, well, who are you protecting and who are you serving? I'm here to enforce the law on whose behalf, do I enforce the law for those individuals who just look like me, or do I enforce the law for those who look different than me? Do I protect and serve those who look like me, or do I protect and serve those who look differently from me? So that was the biggest challenge, because the key here is that if you don't know how to connect with your customer base, you're going to miss the treasure of what's happening out there, because you find yourself working hard as opposed to smart.
Mhm. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I think over time, we have the tendency to be gravitate towards people that are very similar to us in characteristics. And I think that can stem from something that is a concept that you're very passionate about, and that's unconscious bias. Can you, for those that may not know what unconscious bias is and how it can play into our decision-making process when it's either hiring or maybe it's when we're prospecting or doing sales, can you open up and talk a little bit about that?
Unconscious bias is simply a bias that has not been dealt with for a while. For example, we know that between the ages 0 and 6 is when the basic personality of a child is formed. Most of the learning takes place during that period of time because of imitation or emulation. And everything after that is a reinforcement of those beliefs, and that background would happen. Now, when you talk about unconscious bias, then that only manifests itself in times of stress, or some kind of a dilemma. And it's something that's really always in the back of our head, because it's a learned behavior. Folks will say sometimes, well, they will make a comment or something, and they say, oh my God, where did that come from? It's not in my psyche. If it was never there in the first place, it would never be recaptured. And so as a result of that, because of that stressful situation, it tends to come out. And so, and people are mystified that it happens. So I said, well, think of it this way. If it was not there, you can't utter it. Now, think about, if you woke up tomorrow morning, what's the likelihood that you would wind up speaking perfect Arabic? It would not happen, because it was never there. So the unconscious bias then impacts the decisions that we make. And sometimes those decisions can be very detrimental. For example, when we think about Officer Chauvin and he put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, I don't think he had any idea the impact of that particular incident. What did it cost? $500 billion in damages as a result of that decision. And then look at what the amount of money that they just spent on the death suit. Tremendous amount of money. Now, how does that impact your insurance? In your insurance business, then you are going to have to insure certain clients. Can you afford to have a client who is doing those unconscious bias things that's costing those large sums of money?
Mhm.
That's gonna and that's a huge piece. So the question you ask yourself right now: are we doing the kinds of things that's going to ensure that we, first of all, get our piece of the pie, and at the same time doing those things that are going to be financial beneficial to us, as well as being able to make the connection with the people we're trying to impact or influence? Because, for example, in the insurance business, who are your clients? What do your clients bring to the table? If you have a bias against African Americans, for example, or women, whatever, all you have to do then, to bring you to your senses, is to look at the buying power of those individuals with whom you have an issue, and ask yourself, can I afford to disenfranchise those people? For example, 85% of all purchasing decisions are made by women. Can you afford to ignore that? And look at the trillion-dollar industry of the African American community. Can we ignore that? See, so the question is right now, how are we going to get our piece of the pie, and at the same time understand the impact that bias would have that prevent us from being able to do that?
Mhm. And how might someone recognize where their unconscious biases are, and how might we overcome those?
When you are talking to people, There are individuals who, from time to time, will identify your blind spots. They will tell you, well, Matt, you know, you made that comment. I don't think that was right. Because they become like a mirror for you. For those who don't have someone who's going to, like we saw, pull their coat, it manifests itself in complaints, lawsuits, and things of that nature. And there's always something that's going to get their attention. The question is then, so you ask yourself then, I need to really take a look at what bias is, how it impacts me, and what I can do about it. But so the question is, ask yourself, you have to first of all define what it is. So what is bias? Bias is a preference for or against someone or something. Do we all have them? Sure we do, because it's how we have been able to survive to date. There are individuals out there say, well, I'm the least biased person in the world. That person is clueless, because the key right now is that when we take that position that I am the least biased person in the world, or I don't have any bias, that is kind of ignoring the fact of life, that it is there. And it's a kind of way, I call it a circumlocutionary avoidance, if you will. And that is to talk about everything else rather than be able to identify what it is that's confronting us. And so that becomes very, very problematic. And how do you get beyond that? When someone says that you are biased, don't become defensive. Just say, well, what do you mean? Explain, tell me what it is that you see that you feel that I am biased. And then that person would explain it to you. And then you say, like, oh, okay, I never recognized that. And then when it's pointed out, if you can own it, you can deal with it. Do we all have bias? Sure we do. And things will happen sometimes that it sort of catches us off guard. Like, for example, I was at the car dealer. Now, this is making a noise in my car. So I drove in, and there's a young lady there and this guy. So the young lady said, yeah, how can I help you? So I was explaining to her, I got this noise in the car. But at the same time, I was looking at the guy sitting across from her. Right now, what is that unconsciously, I'm looking at her, but I'm talking to her, but I'm looking at him as though he's the person who's going to solve my issue, right? So then she said, well, why don't you take the car out to the guy, take the car out with him, and then see what happens. So we were riding out, and and I started laughing, and I said to the guy, I said, it's interesting, I teach this stuff, but yet I find myself in position of now, I drove in there. I'm talking to her, but I'm looking at you. So I was asking him how long he had been there. He had only been at this dealership for about 3 weeks. See, now my assumption, is that maybe he's the guy with the answers, but the person who had the answers was the person I was talking to, not the person I was looking at. So
men are mechanics, women are, right? Like something somewhere in there that industry is much more male dominated. Right.
Yeah. There are certain roles that we ascribe to certain people, and we're wedded to that, pretty much.
Mm-hmm. And so, if we think about the insurance industry, that could be like that employee that always says those cutesy things, and you say, "Man, you always have it out for those people or that person." Or when they decide on which accounts to go after, or maybe even what areas of the marketplace to actually prospect at, because they think the one area is much more fruitful than the other. Those types of things can really play into, if I understand you correctly, into our subconscious decisions on whether we're deciding to go with A or B, or whether we choose person A versus person B for a job. Is that correct?
Exactly. I had a friend one time, well, an insurance salesperson, young lady. So she was struggling because she was, trying to get her numbers up. And so I said, well, let me ask you a question. Who are your customers? And so she was telling me her customers. And I said, well, you dealing with customers basically who look like you. And that's why you're struggling. I said, now, from a diversity perspective, if you just get a survey and look at the buying power of those individuals that you are not targeting, and ask yourself, do you want a piece of that pie? And so she started looking at this and started looking at, African Americans, women, and all these other groups, and began to realize, there was a big chunk of folks out there that are untapped. You're not, because if you get in your dominant culture, you get a big contract, and this is really great, but your success is going to be the relationships that you build that's going to allow you to get a lot of those medium and small contracts, because the volume and your reputation is what's going to make it for you. You can shoot for that big prize, but you're going to lose a lot in the process. So the idea is, if you look demographically, think about those underserved areas. You see, when you have your meetings and stuff, and you were looking at different areas of the country or whatever, and you're thinking about who you want to target. And what's interesting, unconsciously, sometimes we look at certain zip codes, certain cities, certain boundaries, and if it's one of those areas, that's not quite what we're accustomed to doing, we tend to avoid those areas. And so the question is, if you can find ways to cultivate relationships in those areas, it makes a huge difference, because when you have success with anybody, they're going to tell somebody. And when you recognize that the success in any industry is based on relationships, that's when you're going to be more successful.
Hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's a great, that's such a great example of how someone can effectively prospect more intelligently and be more self-aware of who they're actively trying to prospect and how they're actually going about their prospecting strategies, which I think is really important. I want to shift gears just a little bit, because being a PA state trooper, being an African American, it would be great to get your perspectives on the impacts of George Floyd. He brought out, or I should say, shown even a brighter spotlight on some of the racial challenges that underlie this country as we continue to grow and evolve. And we all, I believe, wholeheartedly want to get to a better place. Whether we know exactly how to get there, I don't know, but I think there's a lot of ideas. But how do you think George Floyd's death will impact society, and perhaps even give maybe a business spin to it? Like, how might this impact us moving forward?
Well, interestingly, let's bring it up. What George Floyd did to the world was groundbreaking. Picture a situation where you have an unwanted child, and all of a sudden, someone videotapes you when they drop that child in your lap, and that child resembles you. You can no longer deny it. What George Floyd did there, it brought racism and dropped it in the lap of every person in America, because you saw it in real time, televised, and there is no way you could mistake what you saw. See, but for that young lady videotaping that, it would have been business as usual. But fortunately, she was able to capture that. And so right now, all of a sudden, we find ourselves right now, you're getting tinged by that. Now, picture this. I think it's in 1880 when we had the volcano erupted at Mount St. Helens. That volcano had been brewing for over 100 years since the one before that. Seismologists and geologists were warning everybody in that area to vacate. Well, there was a guy at the end of the hill named Harry Truman, not the president, but Harry Truman. He was about a 57-year-old guy. And he'd been there for a number of years, but he would refuse to move. And when that volcano erupted, that molten lava came down that hill and consumed him and everything in its sight. George Floyd then indicated that that volcano that had been of racism that had been erupted for many years, and that lava came out of that volcano and it impacted every single person in America. So now we can no longer deny that this thing exists. And so the question to ask ourselves right now, are we going to sit there at the bottom of that hill and be consumed by this lava, or are we going to move and make some kind of adjustments then to be able to deal with what we have been saddled with, in reality?
And taking that and bringing it into the workplace, how can an employee make someone who is not exactly the same as them, whether that's gender, sexual identity, orientation, background, whatever the case may be, how can we make them feel more included in the workplace? Even if we perhaps may not know that we may say or do something that makes them feel uncomfortable because of that unconscious bias.
This stuff in the workplace is like dating. You have to say the right things and do the right things. If you are really sincere about inclusion, include folks. There's a social psychological term, propinquity increases attraction, which means that the more we interact with people, the more we begin to understand who they are and what they are really about. And the key here is that when we can look at people in terms of what they bring to the table, that gives us a whole different perspective. We tend to shy away from anything that is unfamiliar to us. And so if you are in an organization, and it has to start from the top down. It's like sweeping stairs. If it's from the top down, the CEO says that, look, we have a mission, vision, and value statement. We want to make sure that every single employee understands that. And that whole process is inculcated into the person's psyche so that they clearly understand the operation of the organization. And as we talk about inclusion, then that means our language, our actions, and everything about us has to be inclusion. For example, I don't know you, but I would say, well, Matt, look, can I have lunch today? Sit down and chat. Tell me about your background. Tell me about, if there's something that you have an issue with, ask the question and let people explain what they are. If someone has a different religion than you, if the person comes in, he's Muslim, and he has to pray X number of times a day, ask him about that religion. If the person is Catholic and you do the gender flag, what is that? Tell me about the Catholic religion. A person is African American. Tell me about the African American church. Tell me about the preachers. Tell me about the whole idea of call and response. Tell me about Negro spirituals. Tell me about much life within the Black community. And that's when you begin to recognize what people are bringing to the table. What's happening, and we say right now, Black lives matter, but at the same time, Black intellect matters. If you think about in the diverse society, we have many times those folks who are different from us, we have often valued them from the neck down for their labor. We're saying now you got to value them from the neck up, because that's how they become included. Every human being has a strong wish or desire to be heard and have their needs met, and when you are inclusion doesn't mean the fact that we can sit at the same table. No, the inclusion means that I am going to be an integral part of the conversation. From the insurance industry, everybody at the top is not always the person who has all the great ideas. Inclusion means then that individual who is the rookie on the thing has a lot to say that can help the person who's that seasoned vet. But we have to, and in this business, then we have a difference between the different age groups, and the millennials and the Xers and all that stuff. And so right now there's a chasm that's created there. So the idea then is, how do we bring those groups together and look at how we form a team so that everyone is basically as if we're in a boat rowing in the same direction.
Mhm. Before I get to my last question, I want to say that what you're doing in the realm of diversity and inclusion, I think is so important, especially as we continue to become more polarized. And I think that was not more evident than what you just said about actually having enough courage to genuinely have an interest in others and their backgrounds and where they come from and their challenges, their struggles, even what makes them excited about life. And I think that um, that could be a lesson that every single person can take away from this podcast for sure.
Yeah.
So my last question then for you before we wrap up is for someone who's listening today and they hear about all these different stories and unconscious bias and getting to know people, if you had to give them one key takeaway that they could start doing tomorrow to improve their life, both personally and professionally, what would that one key takeaway or request be of them?
Well, when I think of what you're saying there, Les Giblin talks about in his book, Connected with People. He says, we're all egoists, and we all have an ego. And we know that a hungry ego is a mean ego. What is a junkyard dog? He has a very heavy chain on him, in the worst conditions. Feed him the worst food, and we treat him like a dog. No wonder he bites. And somehow you have to begin to feed that hungry ego. And this is what happens in our workplaces. And secondly, he says that we're all more interested in ourselves than anybody else. And that makes sense, because if I can feel good about me, then I can feel good about you to maybe make that connection. And thirdly, he says that everybody wants to feel as though they have a significant contribution to make in this workplace, and I think everyone feels that way. And lastly, he says that we seek approval of others in order to approve of ourselves. Now, and so what you will leave people with then is to think about who you are. And if you are satisfied with who you are, then extend yourself to other folks. If you have bias and it's identified or whatever, own it. And then we say, like, shine a spotlight on every once in a while to examine what those biases are and think about how those biases impact your relationship with people in the workplace, and don't be afraid, you know, to face those fears, because it's not an easy task. It is something, it's hard, and so the question is right now, if you can own it, you can deal with it. But if you don't own it, you will never ever deal with it, and you will go through life all the time in denial, and we know what denial is. This is just not just a river in Egypt.
No, I actually such a great way to wrap it up. I love that. Well, Major Ben, as always, thank you so much for joining me and opening up about your perspectives and where you really see the world going. I think it is, again, a message that so many people need to hear. So I am so appreciative of your time today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome.